Hello and welcome to the UKSIF Leadership Podcast. It's James here and I'm really pleased today to bring you a conversation we recorded for last week's UKSIF Autumn Conference with Tomoya Obokata, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery. It was a great conversation, so we thought it'd be well worth sharing it more widely on this podcast. Thank you very much for joining this session of the UKSIF Autumn Conference. It's a session all about modern-day slavery and specifically focusing on China and the Xinjiang supply chain. And I'm absolutely thrilled that we have an incredible speaker with us today. We have Tomoya Obokata, who's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery. Tomoya is a Japanese scholar of international law and human rights, specializing in transnational organized crime, human trafficking, and modern slavery. He was appointed as the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, including its causes and consequences in March 2020, and also currently serves as Professor of International Human Rights Law at York Law School, having previously taught at Keele University, Queen's University Belfast, and Dundee University. He has extensive experience of working on the issues of transnational crime, human trafficking, and modern slavery with relevant stakeholders, including the UK Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, the Northern Ireland Assembly, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, and the International Organization for Migration and the European Union. Mr. Obokata has also worked as a legal clerk for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Japan and has published widely on all of these different topics. Tomoya, thank you so much for being with us. It's absolutely great to have your experience. And I'd just like you to start off. I know you're going to, share with us some thoughts more generally on your role as the Special Rapporteur, on some where we're at in terms of modern slavery, and then maybe focusing in also on China and Xinjiang. So, Tomoya, over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this very important conference today. And I'm very sorry that I could not be there in person because of the ongoing train strikes. So I'm sending this video message instead. I will begin by explaining what I do in my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, as this may be the first time many of you might have heard of this role. I then will touch upon the current state of these practices globally, including what's happening in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. I will finish my talk by providing some thoughts on what needs to be done. Now, in terms of my role as the UN Special Rapporteur, the post was created in 2007 by the United Nations Human Rights Council and has been extended every 3 years since, most recently last month. I deal with issues including traditional slavery, forced and child labor, debt bondage, and forced and child marriage in all regions of the world. The main function, first of all, is fact-finding. For this, I submit thematic reports annually to the Human Rights Council, as well as the United Nations General Assembly. This year, my report to the Council looked at the exploitation of minorities around the world, and one submitted to the General Assembly last month explored the nature and extent of contemporary forms of slavery in the informal economy. Through these reports, I identify examples of good practice in preventing contemporary forms of slavery and protecting victims, as well as ongoing challenges which must be addressed urgently. In addition, I conduct country visits in order to independently investigate the nature and extent of contemporary forms of slavery and how governments and other actors are addressing these practices at the national level. To date, I visited Sri Lanka and Mauritania, and I will be visiting Costa Rica from next week. In addition to state practice, I look at contributions made by businesses and employers, as well as others like trade unions and civil society organizations in preventing and suppressing contemporary forms of slavery. Aside from fact-finding, I also respond to allegations of contemporary forms of slavery by sending so-called communications to governments and private entities, including businesses independently and together with other experts, such as the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. These communications allow them to respond to allegations and implement necessary measures to prevent future instances of contemporary slavery. As an example, over 160 communications have been sent to China and other governments as well as businesses in relation to forced labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region since 2021. Now, having explained what I do, I now wish to move on to the current state of contemporary form of slavery in the world. According to the most recent global estimates issued by the International Labour Organization, International Organization for Migration, and Walk Free Foundation, 50 million people are trapped in modern slavery on any given day. This equates to 1 out of every 150 people in the world. The particularly vulnerable groups include women, children and young people, older workers, minorities, indigenous peoples, migrant workers, and workers with disabilities. 5 sectors are said to be affected by forced labor the most, and they are services, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, and domestic work. In terms of geography, Asia and the Pacific comes at the top in terms of forced labor, followed by Europe and Central Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Arab states. The situation has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and humanitarian crises such as armed conflicts, which resulted in worsening working conditions and unemployment among a large number of people across the globe. This figure is alarming because the number of victims has actually increased since the last estimates of 40 million people back in 2016, and also clearly demonstrates that the international community still has some ways to go to end contemporary forms of slavery by 2030, as per commitment made under Sustainable Development Goal 8, particularly Target 8.7. Having said this, it is also important to recognize some positive developments which have been emerging. For example, governments around the world have enacted legislation to prosecute and punish contemporary forms of slavery. Also, promotion of human rights due diligence by governments and businesses themselves is becoming more visible. So, for instance, as you know, the UK has enacted Modern Slavery Act in 2015, which requires annual publication of a modern slavery statement by applicable companies. And Australia has adopted a similar approach in 2018. But others have gone further to promote mandatory due diligence, as can be seen in countries like France and Germany. As you may be aware, the United States also recently passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which prohibits imports made by forced labor in that region. And Canada is currently considering a similar approach along with the European Union. Aside from legislative intervention by governments, an increasing number of companies have taken voluntary steps to strengthen human rights due diligence by adopting specific policies and implementing them at all levels of their business operations. And these emerging good practices are to be commended. Now, specifically focusing on the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, I made a reasonable conclusion in my report this year that forced labor has been happening in the region, affecting Uyghur and other minorities based on an independent assessment of available information from all sides. Agriculture and manufacturing are among the industries implicated for this. The practice of forced labor has been facilitated firstly through vocational and educational training, where workers are detained and subjected to work placement, and secondly, through labor transfer under poverty alleviation programs where surplus workers are transferred to various industries. Now, the government has claimed that these programs have been providing employment and income-generating opportunities for many minority workers and alleviating poverty among them. But I made a conclusion that the indicators of forced labor, such as long working hours, restriction on the freedom of movement, physical and sexual harassment and violence, and excessive surveillance were evident in many cases. So the question is, what can be done to address contemporary forms of slavery in China and elsewhere in the world? First and foremost, there is a clear need to implement stronger human rights due diligence within businesses, from headquarters to supply chains. This must be rigorously monitored internally and externally to ensure that the workers' rights are protected throughout. In particular, companies must ensure that their working conditions are in line with the established international human rights standards. This means, among others, that they must provide fair wages, safe and healthy working environment, access to paid annual and sick leave, and other benefits without discrimination of any kind. For investors, they should regularly assess whether their investment activities are in line with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as this will promote responsible investment and lending practices. The Modern Slavery Act does not specifically require institutional investors to consider the possible impact of their financial investments of modern slavery in their annual statements, but I would encourage them to do so in order to promote transparency. Stronger action against money laundering is also important, as a large amount of illegal profits are generated from modern slavery each year. And this will require closer cooperation and communication with the relevant authorities in the UK and beyond. In addition, they should work with companies they invest in order to strengthen human rights due diligence on the ground. For those failing to do so, investors can put additional pressure on them to improve. Moreover, there still is a need to enhance knowledge and awareness among investors on contemporary forms of slavery and human rights due diligence. I suggest creating a focal point within your firms who can train your employees and provide relevant advice if this has not been done already. Investors should also take part in investor-led or multi-stakeholder initiatives which exist in various parts of the world, such as the Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking in Asia and Pacific, to promote dialogue and share good practice with relevant stakeholders. Finally, I suggest that they work closely with governments, civil society organizations, trade unions or workers' organizations, as well as regional and international organizations to promote a joined-up approach to effectively tackle contemporary forms of slavery and promote human rights due diligence. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tomoya. That was so incredible, and I think the amazing ideas, practical steps that people can take that could help this is so important to hear. And I'm sure I'm going to come back to that a little bit. I want to just read a paragraph from your report, because you put this very strongly in your remarks just then. But your report, I think, is so stark in what it says. It says, paragraph 23 says, based on an independent assessment of available sources, including submissions by stakeholders, independent academic research, open sources, testimonies of victims, consultations with stakeholders, and accounts provided by the government, the Special Rapporteur regards it as reasonable to conclude that forced labor among Uyghur, Kazakh, and other ethnic minorities in sectors such as agriculture and manufacturing has been occurring in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. And then it goes on to talk about distinct state-mandated systems. I guess This is so powerful. This is a report that you have written as a special rapporteur to the UN Human Rights Council. How come this didn't make front page news around the world? Why is this not really big, news?
Well, thank you. I think I've been, it has actually gained the global attention, particularly the Uyghur communities, and I think that's most important to me. And I have, I've done some interviews with some medias, but I think hopefully I've been able to make my own contribution to raising awareness about these issues and urging the government to do something about it. And obviously, there is a degree, obviously, a denial by the relevant government authorities and so on. But hopefully, I was able to do something to raise their concerns and experience.
Yeah, and it's so for us as UKCIF, it's so important that we get this message out there. This is, modern day slavery is something that we really want to work on, to tackle, to eliminate, and we see a role for investors in doing that. And you've talked about some steps that investors can take, but what do you see as likely to happen now at the international or at the UN level? You're obviously very plugged into where the conversation's moving at the UN level. Is there likely to be action here? Do you imagine the UN doing things about this?
In terms of the Chinese situations, and that becomes quite political because, for example, during the last regular session, a number of countries has proposed to hold a debate on the Uyghur situation in the next session, but that was actually voted down by China and along with other countries which actually support China as well. So there is a huge political dynamics, but I mean that's the political things. But we will continue. I am an independent expert, and as I said, we also have other experts such as the working group on business and human rights, and we continue to monitor the situation there. It is obviously unfortunate that we cannot actually visit there to properly investigate. I don't think China will ever allow that, but we can gather information in different ways, and there's a number of, as I said, I've also talked to the victims and Uyghur organizations and independent academics and international organizations. So there are ways that we can gather information. But as you might know, the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Bachelet, she also published a report on the Xinjiang before she left her office in August, and her report and my report actually do resonate quite well because our findings are quite in conformity with each other. So once again, that kind of enhances the credibility of our reports and just kind of shedding a light on what's happening in that particular region. So we will continue to monitor the situation as independent experts. And what happens at political level, I mean, it remains to be seen, unfortunately.
That's great to hear, and good to hear around the other reports that are also corroborating this. You talked about some of the industries that this affects, and manufacturing and services and other things. We know, of course, that lots of things manufactured and created in Xinjiang end up on our shelves here. Can you give some more specifics on the types of industries that investors should be really focusing on as being at kind of high risk of having slavery in the supply chain?
Sure. Some of the industries mentioned already was, for example, cotton production. So you're talking about the garment industry that probably highly likely to be affected by this, and or the fashion industry. And there's also solar panel production, and also lots of mechanical kind of little bits and pieces are being produced in that region. So I think that these are the kind of good examples, but there are other companies. So as I said, we sent the communications to a number of companies, including the British based companies and Japanese and American and so on. And just, these are the allegations. What are you doing to address it? Then, I think, a number of companies are actually already have good systems in place to monitor or promote human rights due diligence. And I think that is an encouraging sign. But I do encourage investors. I have again important role to play to work with these companies to ensure that their business operations are in line with the human rights standards, and they have can exercise influence over their business practices, and shareholders as well, and financial institutions too, of course.
Of course, yeah, of course, and so as an investor, you can have the ability to engage with company management and ask them questions and expect them to do these studies and make sure that they are doing them. But I suppose how does a company actually really fully assess supply chains are enormous and they kind of span all sorts of different things right across the world. What are the ways that companies can actually do this?
Absolutely. I mean, so that's where the difficulty lies. Obviously, the companies in, for example, Southeast Asia, in China, and so on are very small. There's a large number of operations, so it does become difficult for that kind of those companies' headquarters in London, for example, to actually assess. So there must be a better system of communication, first of all, and training and coordination between the supply chain and headquarters. And I think that still there's a scope for improvement. And as I said, many companies say, well, they're internally monitoring, but ideally there must be an external oversight, independent oversight, to ensure that actually the factories in Thailand or Cambodia are producing or protecting the rights of workers in line with the established standard. So for unannounced visits, for example, something like that. I think that these things do happen to many companies and to many supply chains businesses. I have no doubt, but I think there's much scope. And whether that can be done, again, on a voluntarily, that's being done. But if that doesn't work, then the next step is mandatory due diligence. So as I said, already countries in Europe, Germany, France, Norway, Switzerland had legislation in place, so they have to do it. So it's not enough to just produce a statement like in the UK or Australia. So if they don't do it, and that means there will be a legal accountability. And obviously, companies have every interest in preventing that, because that does hurt their image, first of all, and that would also have a knock-on impact on the profitability. Nowadays, consumers are not stupid; they are very much aware of human rights issues, and increasingly seeing consumer boycott using, for example, Twitter, social media, and that actually does play a huge role. So all of these, the message I want to send is all of these are interconnected. The human rights protection and profitability go hand in hand. And I think that business should understand it and implement it accordingly. And that also goes to the investment firms and financial institutions as well in their lending practices. If they are investing in companies which may be implicated for this, that does have a knock-on impact on their reputation, for example. And so that's why I think I would encourage that the investment and financial communities to be more vigilant in checking to make, and the investors can serve as an additional check. But whether the UK is heading towards that is uncertain, because I know that the Modern Slavery Act is being reviewed. But from some of the discussions I've seen, I don't think there's any move towards mandatory due diligence. Whether that may be a good thing or not, I do advocate for a stronger due diligence, whether through legislation or otherwise.
That's super. Thank you. And I think that's a really important point to raise. I think we think that in the UK we've got really strong modern day slavery laws, and I think they were amongst the best. But your sounds like Germany and other places have gone one step ahead of us. Is that sort of laws that you'd like to see replicated here in the UK?
Sure, I think that would be helpful. I think that would encourage companies even more. Then, as you know, the European Union is also about to issue a directive on this. So it's mandatory due diligence, as well as prohibiting the imports made as a result of forced labor. So again, UK and Japan, my country, among those two countries within the G7, which are lagging behind. And I think that's, whereas other countries like US, Canada, Germany, France, and so on, they're already taking steps to make this stronger. But my guess is that the move, again, the international community is moving towards that direction anyway. So before this legislation, I think company might as well adjust their behaviors at this stage on a voluntary basis, and that's even better coming from them as opposed to being imposed to do this and that. And that does actually, once again, enhance their reputation as a human rights defenders, investors and financial institutions. So I would certainly encourage, businesses to do that on a voluntary basis.
And it's so interesting to hear that this is clearly the direction of travel on the international from countries individually and the EU and others. This is going to happen. You might as well get ahead of it. And that's one of our messages on a whole lot of different sort of sustainability related regulations and policies. This is all going to come in eventually.
Absolutely.
Get ahead of it and get yourself.
And other issues would be like, ESG and like on environmental issues, like climate change has become such an important topic within the international community. So what I do also, also look at, for example, the impact of climate change and modern slavery and how that has a knock-on effect on businesses and financial, communities and investment communities and as well. And again, as there are private investors, they are more increasingly looking for ethical investing as well. So they would be willing to pay their money for something, investment funds, for example, that does pay attention to these things, and I think the number is increasing. So there is that dynamic as well. So I think again we are moving towards that direction within the investment and financial community.
Yeah, for sure. And you might not be aware of this, but the UK FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, has just published a new set of regulations called the SDR that we've been involved in, and perhaps in that you could create a fund that is focused on reducing or eradicating modern day slavery, and you could call that a sustainable fund. And it'd be interesting to see if people want to create funds like that.
I think that would be innovative, and I think that would be one of a kind, and I think there will be strong interest because if people do care about how these things are being produced, you think that these things are being produced, for example, in Southeast Asia, somewhere remote, but things, this can be also happening in UK. So there was a case of, for example, the online retailer being implicated. There are factories in some Midlands and being implicated for exploiting, for example, migrant workers and ethnic minorities and so on. And so those allegations can arise in this country as well, not in this sector. And there are also other, like, again, agriculture, construction, and so on, where these industries are heavily reliant on some of these workers, and many from many are foreign nationals. And so there is a question as to how they need to treat these workers, whether domestic or foreign. So these issues are going to continue. So, and I think your ideas about maybe specific fund on these things could emerge, and I hope that would be an interesting development, I would say.
Fantastic. And so when as investors, one of the things we can do is we can be active owners of the companies that we have investments in, and we can engage with company management. So if you had the opportunity to sit down as an investor with the chief execs or the boards of a range of these companies, you talked about fashion industry companies or solar panel, what would be some of the key questions you would be wanting to ask them and to have a conversation about? What are the key questions? Well,
certainly I'd like to examine whether there is a concrete human rights due diligence policy. And I certainly would like to know how that is being implemented on the ground. And so I'd like to see how, again, is it just a headquarter policy issues, or is that being translated to or communicated to the supply chain so that they are complying? And as I said, rigorous monitoring is quite important as well. I think that's where the difficulty lies. I think if you're to rely on all those countries to do it, then it may not be, because because livelihood is again affected, like income generation and profitability. So many companies may not actually be that keen on doing it. So that's why there must be an extra push from the headquarters and levels in London and elsewhere, in New York and elsewhere. I think so. So these are the kind of key things and to look at to begin with, I think.
And so building on that, if you mentioned this UK retailer, and I think I know exactly. I think we all know exactly which one this is, that found slavery in its supply chain a couple of years ago. But that as an example, or any other company that reveals or uncovers slavery somewhere, or potentially is found to have by a journalist or somewhere else, slavery in its operations or supply chain. What should an investor do at that point? Because the knee-jerk thing is to say, oh, we don't want to have these investments and divest. But of course, if at that point you divest, you then lose any power to influence the company further.
Of course, I think you have and I think that's an important point. So I would encourage investors to actually work with these companies and say, okay, these are the allegations. What are you doing? To address it, then it's important to give all companies, a chance to correct their behaviors. Oftentimes maybe it may be that they did not have any knowledge of these things, but on the ground. But that obviously is not an excuse. The fact that they didn't know is should never be an excuse. But so that once again kind of raises an issue about stronger communication, training at all levels of business operations. So it's not enough to train people in headquarters. They have to go from there to the supply chains and ensuring that they are in compliance. Yeah. But yes, so I would suggest that the investors do work with these companies implicated in the first instance. In most cases, I'm sure that those companies actually listen to investors. Someone like myself can say it, but probably the investors have a stronger say because of the relationship that you have with these companies, through like investments and so on. So I do hope that the investors will become more, or financial sector will become more vocal about these issues.
And as well as becoming more vocal, and I think that you're absolutely right. Is there also something that we should be thinking? So if there's a group of people that are found to have been or forced into a position of slavery, is there something that companies have some responsibility to kind of make things right to those individuals?
Absolutely. Access to justice and remedies is quite important. So I mean, obviously the compensation is money is not everything, but compensation, so establishing for example compensation fund, something like that is can be considered I suppose by companies, and then having a closer relationship with trade unions and workers' organizations. They are also in a position to be able to empower all workers, and they do. Again, they are human rights defenders as well. So sometimes, there's a straining relationship between union and companies, which that is given in all industries. But I think it creates environment of respect, a mutual respect between companies and trade unions or civil society organizations would be quite important as well. So certainly access to justice and remedies is crucial for victims.
Brilliant. I think we're coming to the end of this session. Sadly, I'm sure we could sit here and talk all day, but I suppose just to finish us off, what is your vision of how this moves forwards over the coming years? How we continue to focus on, achieving the goals on the Sustainable Development Goal 8 that you mentioned, and what's your vision for how we fix this? How we can fix this?
Yes. So as I said, though, I want to send a message that protection of workers' rights and profitability go hand in hand. So the only way I think to make profit in whatever the sector it is to protect and promote human rights. But that should not be the reason why to protect human rights. That should come from the beginning, and so I'd like to again keep sending this message to all sectors, and increasingly investors and financial sectors. They have an important role to play, and they have been forgotten, to an extent in the discourse of human rights due diligence. But on the contrary, they have a crucial role. So I do hope that this language of human rights and due diligence would become quite important within your own sector and community. And I'd like to say, if there's anything I can do for my part to open that dialogue and providing advice and so on, I'll be very happy to be approached. So please keep that in mind, and feel free to contact me anytime for any. I'll be very happy to appear before your workshops and meetings and things like that in order to promote human rights due diligence at different levels.
That's absolutely wonderful, and I think that message of focusing on the risks, and this is what sustainable investors focus on a lot, is focusing on the ESG risks, but also the impacts. And I think you've really summed that up nicely in that kind of profitability and protection of human rights go hand in hand. But that's not the main reason to do this. We want to focus on addressing and mitigating negative impacts at the same time. So yeah. So important and such a great message. Tomoya, thank you so much for being part of today's conference. I really hope that this, that we can do our small part as UKSIF in making your findings more well known to people that can do something about them. So thank you for being part of this.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And once again, I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. And maybe in the future, if there's an opportunity, I'll be very happy to come along again.
We'd love to have you in person in future. Thank you so much, and keep up all the good work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed it, and remember to review us and subscribe for more content coming up very soon on this podcast.